I would like to observe that where I am, it is 11 o'clock on the 11th of November, Remembrance Day. In recognition of the fallen, I will take a moment to read In Flanders Fields, followed by the Ode of Remembrance. In Flanders fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below, we are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field. They shall grow not old, as that we that are left to grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them. Thank you for taking that time together. Well, I would now like to welcome you to our latest SEGRA conversation. For those who don't know me, my name is Kate Charters, and I am the chair of the National Steering Committee for Sustainable Economic Growth for Regional Australia, or SEGRA for short. SEGRA is recognised as Australia's most credible independent voice on issues affecting regional Australia. Established 24 years ago, it was set up to ensure issues affecting regional, rural and remote Australia were given a voice. SEGRA aims to encourage networking, sharing of ideas, success stories, policy proposals amongst regional economic developers, community developers, government, elected officials, private and not-for-profit sectors, and researchers. Joining me today is Robert Prestipino, the Principal of Vital Places. Robert has extensive experience in place-based thinking and design, and has a particular interest in whole of community engagement in developing investable business cases. Before I welcome and introduce our speaker for today, I would just like to run over some housekeeping. As we're fully subscribed today, in fact, one of our biggest registrations today, the format will not allow for direct speaking from registrants. Can I please encourage you to use the Q&A button or the chat box to participate, and I will try and get to as many of you as I can. The webinars are all recorded and are available on the SEGRA website, www.segra.com.au, and they're also available on the SEGRA YouTube channel. Well, I would now like to warmly welcome Peter Kenyon to our webinar. Many of us know Peter well for the work he has done now over many decades in small town Australia, and we're delighted to have you here with us today. Peter refers to himself as a community enthusiast and social capitalist. He's motivated by the desire to help create caring, healthy, inclusive, connected and enterprising communities and local economies where all community members feel they matter, belong and can contribute, and where communities discover and mobilise their strengths and transform themselves. Peter, as I've already referred, has been in this space for a long time and has had an extensive background as a youth worker, teacher, youth education officer, tertiary lecturer and senior public servant. His employment experiences have included Director of Employment in WA, Manager of the Community Employment Development Unit in New Zealand, Coordinator of the Natal KwaZulu Job Creation and Enterprise Strategy in South Africa, and Youth Employment Advisor to 26 countries in Africa, Pacific, Middle East, Asia and Europe. So a truly international speaker with us today. Peter runs an organisation called the Bank of I.D.E.A.S, which stands for Initiatives for the Development of Enterprising Action and Strategies. Peter has worked with over 2,500 communities across Australia, New Zealand, Southern Africa and North America, and undertaken work assignments in 59 countries, helping communities spark their own ideas and invest themselves in building sustainable futures. Still very active in the rural development space, Peter is involved in coordination of the Rural Entrepreneur in Context units at Marcus Oldham University, formulation of the Midwest Aboriginal Suicide Prevention Strategy, hosting of the Community Builders Weekly webinar series with Rural Aid, and facilitation of Rural Aid's community action plans for 10 drought-affected towns. So a wealth of experience and very current active exposure to the sorts of issues that affect those of us who live and work and invest in regional Australia. The topic for today is the reinvention of small town Australia, the why and the how. And I think it's a familiar statistic to all of us that in the last 50 years, there's been a systematic decline of over 70% of the Australian inland small rural communities. The combination of changing economic and social realities and government and commercial policies have contributed to this phenomenon. In today's presentation, Peter will be identifying reasons for small town demise, but primarily focusing on the importance of small town reinvention and through storytelling, share and elaborate the 4 key building blocks essential for revival, namely community mindset, local leadership, healthy community building practice, and key economic development behaviours. So thank you very much, Peter, and welcome to our 31st webinar.
Thanks very much, Kate, and welcome, Robert. Thank you for that incredible introduction. I can often say I can hardly wait to hear myself speak after all of that. But like you, I want to begin by just acknowledging country. I'm sitting currently in Noongar country in Western Australia, and wherever you are across this continent, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of where you might be, thanking them for their leadership and above all their stewardship over up to kind of like the last 70,000 years. They've been an amazing stewards of this land, and I just want to say thanks for that. Like Kate also, today is a significant day. And for me, having a grandfather who experienced and survived Gallipoli as part of the British Army, then went on to the Western Front, and then was caught up coming out to Australia as part of that post World War I, settled the land type programs and took up a farm, only to find he had to walk off it during the Depression that then hit. But again, I suppose I owe so much to him and the love of kind of like rural communities and what that instilled in me. And again, like Kate, just want to acknowledge people who have given so much for us in the past through their service for this country. Today also, believe it or not, is 11 years, and my good friend Jen Watt from the Mary Valley, kind of like when she heard I was speaking today, reminded me it was 11 years ago that the communities in this valley were saved from the desire of the Queensland government to flood the whole area. 11 years ago today was when the government gave up that crazy plan to kind of like wipe out all of these communities and farms. And it was very much due to the amazing efforts of kind of like communities there. I had the privilege of working with these communities on how to rebuild some of that area. And I'm just aware of the amazing community building and the sense of humor, the creativity people use, both in saving these communities, but also in helping to rebuild them. And I just want to acknowledge Jan and the Mary Valley at this time, because today is auspicious as well for them, because this is the day that their freedom was restored to them and the decision was made not to move with that kind of like decision. I'm a small towns boy. I believe passionately in small towns. This is where my birth origins come from. It's a little ex-mining community, still a bit of mining going on there, called Marble Bar. Today, still a community of over 200 people who still live there. you may know it as this town that's known as the hottest town in Australia. And the reason why this town, as part of its assets, plays upon being this hottest town with a number of those features where you can get yourself photographed or whatever, was back in 1931-32, the temperature went over 100 degrees for 167 consecutive days. So that's why it's got that title. But I love the fact that people have played upon that. And I love particularly that sign down there in the bottom right-hand corner. Marble Bar still is a vibrant little community. I can remember running less than 12 months ago an amazing workshop there with over 40 people who had retired into that town, talking about what it is that aging people needed and what is it that we as a community could actually do. Marble Bar is also well known for its Marble Bar Cup, like many of our remote towns. One thing about it, though, is they used to have what was the last race, was where everyone stripped naked and ran around. But the intervention of the local police meant that now it's called the undies race, where people only strip to their underpants. But this is part of the character, and this is part of what we love about these kind of like small towns. I think being associated most of my life and living and working in small towns, the one thing I've really loved is that particular quote. The nice thing about living in a small town is when you don't know what you're doing, someone else does. And that's part of the charm of what these communities are about. So small towns, this is the statistics according to the ABS going back to 2006. Approximately 9.7% of our population, and they believe that there's about 1,702 towns. But they call a small town between 200 and 10,000. I've not been able to work out what happens to those who might be under 200. Why aren't they acknowledged? And I'm sure my friends in places like Harrow there in Victoria, which sit around about 100 people, will say, you know what, we can be only 100, but boy, we can create a wonderful, vibrant kind of like community and local economy that means something to us. To me, though, the majority of these towns, as you can see, just under 1,100 of the 1,700 happen to have kind of like less than 1,000 people. But a significant number of people still call these places home. And there are still a significant number of Indigenous settlements, remote communities. And despite often the intention of government to kind of like close many of these communities, they still seem to happen. Little town of Whitnum, which for good reason should be closed down because of the asbestos. You know, I believe there's still 7 people still living there because they call it home. We had a premier less than 4 years ago who attempted to close down a whole pile of remote communities here in Western Australia. But they were meaningful to those Indigenous people that live there. And boy, the backlash and the way that people could still claim that these places mattered and we needed them. When it comes to some of the statistics, well, you know, they are aging. They certainly have a higher statistic. Cities, the average age is about 36. In our small towns, is up about 43. But it's aging quickly. And there's one estimate that by 2030, a place like the Wheat Belt, the average age will be between 60 and 65 here in WA. So that is one of the challenges that we actually face in terms of it. And you can see there the breakup in each of our states. In a place like the Territory, still a significant part of the population live there, as they do in Tasmania. But there in a place like Western Australia, you know, this place of 1 million square miles, a massive thing, we have concentrated so much of our population in one city. And those of us who are small towns begin to really question, why is the focus of government when it comes to decentralisation and regionalisation all about regional centre development rather than regional development, where a place is still part for the small town, where we're trying to build the mosaic of communities within our regional areas, as opposed to focusing just on our major centres. Why are they important? Lots of reasons: heritage, culture, identity, tourism. You know, those things matter. So much of our identity of who we are as Australians come out of these places. Realise they still service these small towns, major kind of like economic drivers when it comes to both agriculture and mining. These places are important. And when our small towns are declining, there is an interface, I love to remind people, between the farm and the town. You know, if you suddenly got to drive an extra 100 Ks to do banking, do simple hardware, kind of like purchasing and whatever, that's a productivity issue. Most of our family farms still in rural Australia require off-farm income. And if that small town ain't providing some of those jobs, you know, for family members through education and through their retail outlets and whatever, that again is a productive issue. If, for example, you've suddenly lost your footy club, lost the pub, ain't the place where you as a young farmer want to be because you're not going to be able to see anyone else young, you know, they become very much productivity issues. So I'm one of those people who believe very strongly there's a strong interface between the town and the farm. And the same applies within mining. And then the quality of life. And one only has to talk to people in many of our small towns, you know, go to the towns of that I've already mentioned, you know, like the Harrows of the world, the Lockingtons in Victoria, the Coolins in WA. Talk to people about what's it like to live there, and the quality of life and the connection they feel is just amazing. And again, we can't underestimate the importance of these things. When it came to coronavirus, it was interesting to see how many young people moved back or returned back. And I love this kind of like article that appeared in the West Australian that where Carly quickly captured why to her it was important to kind of like move back into rural Australia. But we all are aware that the future ain't what it used to be for these areas and particularly for these communities. They have gone through tremendous change since the 1900s. You know, back there in 1900, when we become a federation, more people lived on farms and small towns than lived in our cities. But we've seen over the last 120 years a total change. We're now the second most urbanised country in the world. We have 40% of our population captured in 2 cities, 71% of our population captured in our major kind of like cities, over 80% of our population living within 100 kilometres of the coast. That's the reality that we now face. And the reality for many of our small towns is there are so many issues there. And it's not my intent today, I do not have the time to go into them, but I'm sure there are people who are watching who are far better equipped than me to talk about the impact that these type of issues are actually having, particularly kind of like for people in our small towns. Issues to do with globalisation, decentralisation, regionalisation, nationalisation ain't been good. For our small towns, particularly in terms of the withdrawal of services, both commercially and in terms of kind of like government and whatever. But these are the realities that our small towns have faced. We also are aware that agriculture ain't what it used to be. And again, lots of what's happening on the farm is impacting upon our small towns. Where there used to be 4 farm families living there can now often be 1. We only have to look at where the number of Australian farms have been and where they're going to recognise that this basis of many of our small towns, again, there are kind of like real challenges there with the declining number of people on the land. It's impacting, obviously, within our small towns, and why, you know, between probably 70 and 80% of our small inland towns are actually dying. They're aging, they're losing population, they're losing business life, and for many of them, they aren't places where our young people want to be found. Selling the farm because of the realities of the natural calamities, particularly drought, the impact that has had over the last decade has been phenomenal across many of our states of Australia. And then again, a whole pile of other issues which we could kind of like focus on and really are topics in their own right. But, you know, these are challenges. It looks like as we come out of COVID, you know, maybe up to 20% of our online shopping is going to be kind of like, much of our purchase and by shopping is going to be done online. The impact of that, I'm aware from having, for example, just worked in the town of Gayndah, you know, the impact of Coles coming out of the nearby regional centre 2, 3, 4 times a day, delivering online products. And for each of those trucks requiring a minimum of $20,000 to purchase, and they're coming into the town 4 or 5 times a week. The impact that obviously has on local businesses is phenomenal. So let's not underestimate, our small towns face a whole pile of challenges. But can I say one of the issues that I want to quickly touch upon is the model that our governments have actually used for the last 40 years. They call it community development. But fundamentally, we've had a servicing model where we do things to and for community. We commute in. We have become the Toyota cavalry that is actually drives in and out of these small towns and delivers them. And I think this has been one of the factors that have really undermined many of our communities. The fundamental fact that we now have a servicing model that fundamentally does to and for people, where we see people now within our communities as consumers of our services, customers of our services. We've lost that thing of seeing people as citizens. And I suppose one of the things that I have a real appeal for is how do we start to reverse that? How do we get the focus from doing things to and for people with a more of a greater focus as of and by the people? And certainly one of the implications we have for our rural towns is simply this model has led to a model where things are done to us now. And most of our rural communities, I think, can really equate to an Australian rules footy game where 30,000 people who now need the exercise turn up and watch 36 players who've done. And that certainly has been the change I've seen in my lifetime as someone working professionally over the last 4 decades in community development. We have changed the model, and governments have changed the model, and it's had implication. I'm part of the community of Pickering Brook here up in the hills out of Perth. You know, that's this community back in the late 60s building their community hall. Women, children, men coming together, afternoons, a local builder overseeing it. But basically, this whole thing was built by the community. You know what? That's just not viable today. A local government wouldn't allow it to happen, but I cannot envisage the community doing it. Here in WA, we now apply for a Lottery West grant for someone to come and do that for us. And I hunger for the day where we go back to how we built our small towns. You know, we built most of our small towns before we even invented this thing called government. We did it through mutuals. We did it through cooperatives. We did it in a way that brought people together. And I'm really seeking a return to kind of like some of those principles and practices. We're never going to go back to the day where this will be a reality. You know, a place like Dearton there, for example, this is what the local bank staff looked like in 1975. You know, look how many of them, look how young they were. Well, today there's not even a bank in the town. I know times have changed, but I've also seen what the community banking movement did over the last 20 years. And the fact that today we do have those 300 odd community banks, often in our small towns. How were they created? They were created not from top down, outside in, not through some government grant, but by people coming together and identifying a need, but above all, an opportunity, and doing something with it. Our days have changed. We don't have kind of like people staying like we used. But you know what? I still think there's a future for our towns. It's 20 years ago that a certain Professor Gordon Forth advocated that any community under 4,000 should literally be put to death. But as I said, not as easy to do as one would imagine. But, you know, that has been often the attitude within academia, within government, within economic rationalists. We can't afford all of these towns. And even someone like Bernard Salt, the respected Bernard Salt, advocating that the small town village is just not viable. It was something associated with the 19th century. We need to kind of like get rid of it. Well, you know what? I'm not one of those people that subscribe to that, although maybe between 70 and 80% of our small towns are dying. Guess what? Between 20 and 30% are not. They're growing. And I suppose what I'm interested in is focusing on what are they doing that others aren't doing. And to me, I love that African proverb, the sun doesn't forget a village because it's small. You know, let me start with just giving 2 quick examples. One where I had a property for over 20 years, the little town of Balingup there in the southwest of WA. This is a stunning kind of like community, stunning location for a community. But this is a community that had its height back in those late 50s when the population was as high as 1,347 people. But by the late 60s and particularly into the 70s when their main economic focus, which was butter, and Britain joined the common market and that whole market closed up, the population had dropped down to 200 people. Many people just walked off the farm. Many people just gave up. But what's happened? We've actually seen a regrowth in that particular community. And today, one of the most vibrant, one of the most dynamic communities I know, numbers around 600 with 1,500 people in the district. Because what happened was people who saw value in that town started to promote it as a place where young people could come. They recognised, forestry bought up all this land off the farmers and had returned it back to pines and whatever. But there were these amazing pockets which were taken over by the community. And one of the biggest herbariums we actually have in the country is now there. They created the environment where young people moved back with ideas, and you got enterprises like the Tinderbox, which trades now in its natural products all over Australia. The old cheese factory that once employed a pile of people there providing butter and cheese for the UK now has turned into this amazing tourist kind of like opportunity. And boy, that community has started to do things. A community that came together back there in those early 1970s and identified, we've got a few facilities, but if we combine them, we could build our own kind of like useful recreation centre. We need a community centre, and there's kind of like some vacant blocks in old forestry towns. Let's transport them into our town and let's create things, excuse me, like a community centre and a workspace, all done by the community. A community said, what is it that's special about us? How can we turn that into special events? And they instigated the Small Farm Field Day, which has just become one of the most popular kind of like agricultural kind of like field days in Australia. Again, a community saying, you know what, there's something special about us, special interest. How do we kind of like focus upon that? And again, a whole pile of other amazing and creative stuff that reflects the creativity of that community. And it's not just in terms of events, but here's a community, for example, that recognised if they're going to create the environment for people to retire and age in the community as opposed to moving to the regional centre or to the coast, they needed to develop models that would appeal. And here they've developed this amazing community initiative called Village for Hometown Life, where they built as a community 5 cottages that older people can buy into as a way of aging kind of like into the town and whatever. Believe it or not, this is a community of 600 people that's managed to attract the pharmacy into the town and now have a doctor operating within the town. How many country towns we give their right arm for that? But you know what? This is bailing up. And bailing up happens because of people. Bailing up does not happen just because of its location or because of some kind of like characteristic. It happens because people have recognised and have the mindset and the leadership to kind of like instigate those changes that are needed, but based upon what they've got to build with. The other town I love is this town called Coolin. This is a town that I can remember 25 years ago, turning up in a meeting. There were less than 60 people in the room. They were depressed. They had just lost kind of like their bank and whatever. And they decided then, you know what, we're down to about 289 people. We need to rebuild ourselves as a wheat belt type town. And that night they made that kind of like commitment, drew up this particular mission statement. Pretty simple. We're going to stop depopulation and the loss of town services by doing 2 things. Let's become more than a dot on the map, and let's begin to rebuild pride and commitment. So people will retire in the town. People will keep their kids educated locally. People will invest in local businesses and local activity. And boy, over the last 5 years, boy, have they implemented that mission. The population now is just under 600. They've literally doubled their population. And I can show you towns around them that have halved their population that period. But you know what? They've done it. This was not some state government program or national government program. They implemented things. They wanted to become more than a dot on the map. A local farmer said, look, I've got a spectacular site. Why don't we create the Coolin Bush races? And that has now had a 25-year history. It attracts the maximum they're allowed under health regulations is 4,000. It's often booked out 6 weeks ahead. It's an amazing event that brings in all of these people who over a 3-day period party like they've never partied before, but spend in the local town like they've never spent before. The boost to the economy has been amazing. This is a town that asked their young people, what is it that would make a difference in our town? And they came up with a water slide. Young people saying a water slide, and you know what? They took them serious. And some farmer identified on the Sunshine Coast a second-hand water slide for sale. 6 farmers drove their trucks across the country, dismantled it, brought it back, bought it, I think, for $25,000, assembled it, and now Coolin has become the water centre capital of the wheat belt. Where do you think a lot of families on our hot summer days hang out, as this little town of kind of like Coolin, whatever? You know, this is a town motivated by the loss of its bank. The very first community bank in Western Australia was here in Coolin. How did that happen? Local people made it actually happen and whatever. And today we now have well over probably 60 communities in WA building upon the experience of Coolin who have actually done it. This is a town that realised that communities have got to have a wow factor. If you want people to stop and get out of their car and spend, if you want people to want to come and settle your town, then maybe appearance makes a big difference. You don't get a second chance at first impressions. And boy, we have some fairly ugly small towns out there. Here's a town who decided to capture all of those winter water and using that and then recycle it back in the summer months to green and beautify and flower their main street. And boy, have they done an amazing job with that and so on. This is a town that said, you know what, we've got this attraction out in the wheat belt called Wave Rock. You know, there's a traditional way, it's straight up the highway, it bypasses us. But you know what, we could be an alternative route to Wave Rock. Couple of problems. One is we've got to get people perceiving this is worth taking time out to drive this way. And secondly, there's about 60 kilometres of gravel road. The community, through its small local government, committed to kind of like bitumising that road over a 7-year period. They then realised that the farmers on the way out to the racetrack for the Coolin races were building these crazy tin horses. So why not, you know, we've got probably 30, 40 of them. Imagine if we had 200 of them and they started running workshops and competitions and getting people to start to do all these crazy things. And the result of it, they actually had a reason to draw people off it. They also thought, why don't we claim it? The natural thing is, well, let's ask main roads. Well, someone very quickly said, what a stupid thing. Don't ask main roads. Much better to beg forgiveness than ask permission. They just declared their alternative route, the Tin Horse Highway. And I love the humour. They invited the Premier of the day, whose name was Gallup, to come and open the Tin Horse Highway, which he did and added to kind of like the media exposure. Today, it is one of the best known tourist routes in WA. This is a town that looked into its history and discovered it had a sad bit of history. One of the first conscripts ever killed in the Vietnam War was a Corporal Hart. His parents ran the post office in Coolin. They decided to create Camp Hart near the racetrack along that lake as a place where Vietnam families can come on weekends and settle. And you can have up to 60 wagons there of Vietnam vets kind of like camped there and enjoying it. And again, they've become this Vietnam vet friendly town. Again, using just another one of those cultural and story assets that the town actually had. I love the fact that they approach all their visitors and say, how about becoming an ambassador for us? And they've developed this set of amazing posters, which their community development officer, and let me say, went off and did a course on how to put up one of these 6-foot banners without wrinkles and put that on the side of your wagon. And today there's well over 500 people travelling around Australia promoting this small town of Coolin. Let me remind you, it was 289 people who came together, 60 of them, and said, let's make a difference. They've used their heritage to kind of like develop things. And they've also said, like most towns, what's an industry we can attract to towns? But like most towns, they didn't think about some manufacturing thing. They thought of an industry around people. There's someone running a camp program that involved putting on week-long experiences for young kids experiencing trauma, whether they be foster kids, refugee kids, kids who don't have opportunities like others. And the person running it was running that from the city. They invited to come out to Coolin and said, why don't you base your program out here? We've got the facilities, we'll support you. And that program called Camp Coolin that involves well over 1,000 kids every year and hundreds of volunteers coming into the town has just been such an economic boom for the town. It's also provided interesting youth work jobs for kind of like young people. Now, this is a town that has done it well. This is a town that understands that it's about building not just the economic life of the town, but the social life of the town, that a healthy community and a healthy economy are two sides of the same coin, and we need to focus on it. Has it made a difference? Well, they've doubled their population in 25 years. And believe it or not, last year there were more babies born in Coolin than any other place in Australia per population. Boy, this is a town that showed that size does not matter. They are not on any major highway. They are not central to anything, but boy, they've taken what they've got and kind of like kicked some winners with it. So what is that recipe? You know, I think it's fundamentally about four very simple things. I think it's first about proactive and shared local leadership. Leadership is absolutely essential. You know, it was 20 years ago when the Keating government engaged McKinsey and Co to work out why certain regions in Australia were going ahead and others going backwards. They gave them $1 million to do this bit of study. And at the end of it, they came out with a quote that I think literally was worth $1 million. Given the task of rejuvenating a region and $50 million or just $2 million and 20 committed local leaders, we would choose the smaller amount of money and leaders. And I think leadership does matter. And there are aspects about it that I think we do need to recognize. Leadership has a purpose. It needs to be diversified. There does need also to be a leadership strategy. You know, all of our communities have a footpath strategy, that we have a tourism strategy. Very few communities have a community leadership. Very few communities have a community leadership fund. But you know what? The most critical issue for growing a town, according to McKinsey and Co, and according to many people, is leadership. Why aren't we investing in that? And it just seems to me that this is so important. A small US town in Nebraska has a wonderful kind of like leadership statement. If you want to grow, if you want a year of prosperity, grow grass. Want 10 years, grow trees. Want 100 years, kind of like grow people. There are aspects about that leadership that we need to understand. What the role of leadership's about, the role of community builders in that town. It's fundamentally all about relationship building. It's all about harnessing the power of community wisdom and their ideas in terms of what it's about. And it's about also really understanding that this thing called mindset plays a part. You know, next to leadership, mindset is so essential. And I look at so many country towns, their greatest issues are not kind of like the government sitting in Sydney or Melbourne or Canberra. It's negativity, it's change resistance, it's cynicism, those kind of like caustic attitudes that are often within our communities that corrode our communities. And I think a second characteristic of kind of like a community, or the second building block, is how do we begin to develop a positive mindset? How do we get people beginning to recognize, if it's to be, it's up to me. If things are going to happen, let's stop waiting for the cavalry to turn up from Sydney, Canberra or Lottery West. Let's begin to do things ourselves. Let's begin in our communities to accept change and alternative thinking. Let's welcome people who think different to ourselves to come in, and let's begin to air alternative ways of actually doing it. Let's value kind of like idea and opportunity, a kind of like obsession. You know, in the middle of World War II, the US Department of Commerce put out a handbook in America called Small Town Manual for Community Action. They recognized the importance of rebuilding their small towns. And within that handbook, there was a lovely phrase that in their foreword that simply said, no community can use this guide unless the individual reading this forward at this moment can say to yourself, I'm going to pitch in to make it work. You know, communities happen not because of the latest government program or funding. They happen because of people and people's commitment, and their belief that they can do it is just so important. The belief that, look, change is real and it is happening, but we kind of like will embrace that and begin to adapt to it. We need to be kind of like opportunity obsessive constantly. We need to find opportunities to bring people together. Last year, I was in a small US town, and every morning, once a week on a Friday, they run a pancake breakfast where anyone can turn up and kind of like share ideas. Go to the town and the cities of Christchurch, for example, in New Zealand, where they've created what they call the Ministry of Awesome, which is just a weekly lunch where they just provide bread and some toppings and cup of tea, and people come together. And the idea is that every week people can come and share new ideas, and people can debate and discuss the relevance of these ideas and how they might happen. You know what? That's the type of practical stuff we need to see. That positive mindset does need to begin to focus on the half full, not kind of like the half empty bit of the glass. We've got to get away from this community development model that always starts with needs analysis, always starts with what's not there, always starts with what's wrong in a community. Let's begin to start with what works in a community. Let's begin to start with that half full bit of the glass. I love this Snoopy cartoon. You know, someday we'll all die, Snoopy, but true, but on all the other days, we will not. You know, this is one of the saddest signs I've ever seen. You know, I know it's a smart driver education sign, but for a dying town, for a town where most of its population leave every day and drive to the regional centre and face that when they come back, not really smart leadership. And it just seems to me we've got to change our mindset. We've got to start talking up. We've got to start not listening to the negative people. And I certainly learnt that from the former mayor of Christchurch, Vicky Buck, who's just been instrumental in reinventing that city as one of the greatest kind of like cities I know anywhere on the planet. And I always remember saying to Vicky, what is the number one characteristic leaders need? And what she said, it's all about passion and attitude. She went on to say, you know, one of your key roles is to make negative people deviants, because that's what they are. And I always remember at one of our events there, she used this statement in her speech. I think negative people should be taxed. They require an incredible amount of energy. They're like corgis nibbling at your ankles. And I'm sure they're there to show the difference between heaven and hell. You know what? We would not have seen those 321 community banks happen across rural Australia, and mainly in small town, kind of like Australia, if it hadn't been for attitude. You know, this happened, as I said, because a group of people gathered on a Friday outside the old IGA and flogged shares to their neighbours on a Friday night. That's how it happened. People committed to making it happen. You know, Port Fairy, I'm aware it took them 6 years to pull off one of these things. But you know what? There was that committed core group who recognised you can make a difference. And today, you have a look at what that difference has made to regional Australia. You know, this movement is just under 25 years old, but an incredible movement that shows that community economic development does work. And the starting point for that was leadership and attitude. I love these quotes. You can't move your town to a different location, but you can move your town's attitude in a different direction. And at the start, mindset is the starting point for change. Ernesto Ciroli, someone who's had a major positive influence across regional Australia, once made that comment, the future of every community lies in capturing the passion, the imagination, and resources of its people. And therefore, for that to happen, we do need to practice what I'd call healthy community behaviours. And part of that is recognising the importance of broad-based involvement. We cannot run these towns with the same old faces. We've got to get people, we've got to excite people to want to get engaged and beginning to do it. And we've got to begin to recognise the starting point for a lot of this is beginning to identify our assets, not just doing needs maps, but coming up with asset maps. And how we do that, we begin with this thing, the oldest tool in the toolbox for building community, called conversations. How do we start to bring people together to begin to share possibility, begin to share what they care about and who else cares about that, and what is it that we can actually do with some of this stuff? It's about particularly starting to engage young people and using and building upon altruism that is alive and well, but just needs often to be encouraged and provided outlets for, and so on. In particular, how do we begin to engage these particular groups? You're setting up a leadership strategy. Think about how do we help kids as young as 6 and 7 in grades 2 and 3 and 4 in our little primary school start to learn about leadership, start to begin to do things. How do we begin to engage this group who have a whole pile of gifts and talents that we often don't do? And certainly for me in our small towns, there are three periods that we really need to focus on our young people and our children. One, while we've got them, Many of our kids leave at age 12. Many have left by 17. But what are we doing with them while we still have them? What are we doing to give them great memories of our community? What are we doing to give them opportunities to learn citizenship and build a better community? When they're away, when they're traveling, working, studying, what are we doing to keep lines to them? Today with social media, so easy to kind of like keep reminding them of home. And finally, that critical age group that I think we've got to focus on, that 25 to 40, when people are putting down roots, partnering, having babies, buying houses, most businesses are started in that period of time. How do we remind them of home? How do we actually begin to remind them to come home? I found in Nebraska, one of the most popular activities at Chambers of Commerce was running school reunions. I thought, wow, that's a bit strange, but boy, it makes sense. Bring people back, give them a great time, but remind them of their town's opportunities. It's a group that you've probably got more chance of having success with. And in terms of resources, look, just go onto the website of these three groups who've got some amazing resources geared towards engaging our young people and our children in our small towns. No shortage of resources to make things actually happen. And then finally, the critical thing is how do we build strong economic development practices? And to me, every small town needs to have what I call a care strategy. How are we creating, attracting, retaining, and expanding the businesses we've got? And to me, that involves kind of like a number of issues. The one that I just want to particularly focus on is, even within our smallest town, we need to have that entrepreneurial development ecosystem where people who come into that town who might have an idea, how do we wrap around them the information and the opportunities to take that idea and turn it into reality? It may be just a person, it may be a committee, it may be the local post office kind of like owner who's able to give our young people who might have an idea information about grants, may be able to tell them about available workspace, able to connect them with someone who can help them with their marketing or with their accounts. That's what I call about creating that entrepreneurial development ecosystem where a person with an idea can turn that into kind of like reality and so on. There are other things that I think we need to focus on. We all love to kind of like think, what's that industry we can get into town? How can we bring stuff in from outside? But the most important kind of like base is the businesses we've already got. What are we doing to help them grow and expand? Do we have kind of like a business and expansion strategy? What are we doing in terms of soft and hard infrastructure? What are we doing in terms, and particularly at the present time with COVID, when people are wanting to travel into rural areas, what are we doing in terms of selling our story and improving that story? As I said earlier, you don't get a second chance at first impressions. And how do we put kind of like some focus on that? So look, it's not easy, but the formula is simple. It seems to me there are four critical building blocks for which we need to build practical initiatives around. Don't just hope leadership happens, make it happen. Kind of like grow leadership. Don't hope the mindset of a community will change. Use ways to get people talking up and not down. There's no shortage of help in terms of getting people into building behaviours that create healthy communities, not unhealthy communities. And then when it comes to that local economy, how do we actually do things that builds kind of like opportunities for employment and reasons why people can actually stay in our communities? One of the people that influenced me many, many years ago is a guy called Roy Powell. I hope Roy is still alive. He was out of Armidale. He was that academic up there running that regional development program up there in the University of New England. And I always remember this quote he once gave. Nowadays, towns are really not so different from businesses. They need to keep recreating themselves. Not so many years ago, country towns were subject to general trends. They'd all do well and they'd all do badly. The picture now is very uneven. The successful towns are likely to be driven by people who are passionate and creative, can see an opportunity and go for it. You need communities with a bit of get up and go spirit. Some have it and some don't. And you know what? I still think that definition of reality of small towns is still relevant today. I still think what Roy said so many years ago is still true today in terms of reality and what's needed. And my final kind of like quote is simply this. It comes out of the Heartland Center for Leadership Development, a group committed to growing small town America. And I love what they said. Conventional wisdom suggests for a small town to survive, it needs to be near a major highway, have significant natural resources in the region, be close to a large city, or have some other characteristic or circumstance work in its favour. Yet in reality, leadership is proving more important than location, and attitude is more important than community size. And if our strategies are not dealing with leadership and not dealing with attitude, you know what? We're not dealing with reality. So there's my take on small town Australia. I believe passionately in this mosaic of 1,700 communities out there. I believe they have so much to offer, and particularly in this post-COVID time when people are wanting to reconnect with the village, wanting to realise that they can actually work where they love rather than work where their work may live where they love rather than live where they work. To me, we have never had a greater chance and opportunity to promote the importance of small towns. So, Kate and Robert, that's my take on small town reinvention.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was an amazing presentation, very rich, and I'm pleased that we've recorded it. I've been taking notes, but I'm sure I'm going to be going back to look, and just to put in a bit of a plug there, Peter's got down the bottom of the slide, which I've left up, how to subscribe to Peter's newsletter. I'm a subscriber, and I certainly encourage other people to be a subscriber. We've got a couple of minutes for questions if people would like to send them in, and we also just have some interesting chat. You obviously enthused a lot of people, Angus, because we've got someone who's come in saying, brilliant presentation, I need to watch it again. Will the recording be shared? Yes, on the SEGRA website and also on the SEGRA YouTube channel. And we'll send out an email on Friday when that becomes available. Another interesting comment was someone who was actually at Coolin when the first Bendigo Bank outside Victoria was established through regional advocacy, and a town which built the building in 6 weeks and had 500 at the opening. So a great endorsement of Coolin. And another comment was, if I can quickly find it, was that they Carlston, I think it was, in Victoria, Casterton in southwest Victoria, continues to thank you, Peter, for the wonderful work you did in the community back in 1995-96. So an enduring legacy, building confidence and vision in the community. Casterton is now nationally and internationally recognised as the birthplace of the Kelpie breed. Thank you again, Peter. And
can I just say on that one, Kate, I still vividly remember this is a town that I think Geoffrey Kennett managed to rip the guts out of when he removed so many services from that part of the world. And I remember this was a town that took a group photograph in the main street with this huge sign, "A town too tough to die," and it appeared right across. And from that, they then instigated, through their efforts, a whole pile of initiatives, including when they looked at their assets, this claim that they were the Kelpie kind of like dog capital. This is where the Kelpie dog came from. And boy, have they used that effectively to kind of like build both economic and special event attraction. But an amazing community. We got some great towns out there, and Caston is one of those great ones.
I think one of the other things that Robert and I've noticed in our work, and you hinted at this a little bit, was that rather than focusing on what are the problems, what are the negatives, but what are the values of your community, and a lot of your presentation drew on the fact that these communities had a sense of what they valued and what they wanted in their community going forward. And I think that's a good place to start. Another thing that's come in relates to that, understanding your own area and your own region and what you have to offer. And certainly at SEGRA, we've been following Geotourism Australia very closely. Angus Robinson from Ecotourism Australia's from Geotourism Australia has been very active in this space in terms of adding considerable content value to traditional nature-based tourism, and that Australia, particularly remote outback Australia, has a lot of interesting landscapes, geologies, flora and fauna that people can enjoy, provided there's an interpretive trail of some kind that's linked to it. And the Tin Horses, I guess, reminded me of trails. Segra next year is going to be in Kalgoorlie Boulder, and they have a Golden Triangle Trail that's very interesting. The other comment that's come in is Mackay has put a lot of effort into young leadership training, young leadership development, not training. And the council has enabled a number of professional development groups for young business people to try and develop their leadership skills. I've just got two questions here. One is from Joe, and they're drawing attention to the fact that the Victorian local government currently has a focus on deliberative engagement, which comes from the place of focus of a problem requiring deliberation. Now, I don't know about that program, but you're smiling, Peter. Does that mean you do?
No, it's typical that we always start with a problem, and you have a look at most applications for funding from our philanthropic groups and whatever. I can always guarantee that for half of them, the first question is, what's the problem you're going to solve? And I'm saying right from the start, get your language right. What's the opportunity we're going to exploit? What's the, it's this, I don't know what it is about the Australian mindset, but we want to always deal with the half empty bit of the glass and what doesn't work. And we come from a problem point of view. Most of our local governments go out and the first question they ask their community is, what's the matter? I mean, what a dumb question. What's more important is to ask what matters to you. Getting people's engagement. It's what you talked about, values, not saying what is it we can actually do for you, but what matters to you? What do you care about? The most important question we can ask anyone in community is, what do you care about? And who else cares about that? And how do we get people together? But when we come in and the immediate response all the time is, what's the problem? What's the matter? How can we help you? Well, people are naturally going to respond that way. And to me, it's just so dumb that we have done it. It's the same. I have banned any of the people associated with using SWOT analysis. Yes, there are the strengths, but I can tell you what people love to focus on is the weaknesses. And it seems to me we need new ways of not ignoring that things aren't working and there are challenges and there are problems, but putting the focus on, it's not a smart place to start the conversation. If you want to get people talking up, then start with appreciative questions. And I'm a great believer in appreciative inquiry. If people are not aware of that, it's so easy. It's about drilling into the positive core of a community or an individual or a business and starting with that and not asking, how can we do it better? But starting with the question, how can we get more of that? Because it's working. And it just seems to me that's part of where we might want to go. Can I also just quickly, you talked about the geotourism. I was privileged to be in their workshop up in Mount Magnet only a few weeks ago when the Midwest launched their bid to become Australia's first geotourism area. And boy, there's some exciting stuff through all of that. I was also there because I was the Tidy Towns judge for the Midwest, and I'd just driven all through 3,000 kilometres through that part of the world, and I was blown away by the landscapes and the natural features. And boy, there's some amazing assets out there. I'm also aware in that part of the world, wildflowers and the wildflower trails. I'm aware how towns out there are linking up. And also the dark sky movement out there, all about sky tourism and the amazing project work happening there. And it seems to me people are now starting to think outside the box and beginning to do with it. I'm also aware that there was a famous and bizarre and crazy Catholic priest out there in the 1920s and 30s who went around designing all these amazing Art Deco churches and buildings and using the natural products. And they happen to now be in 10 towns out there. And these communities are now discovering, you know what, we've got one of them, but together we've got something precious here. So we got the geo tourism trail, we got the dark skies, we got the wildflower trails, we've now got the Monsignor John Hawes trail. It's great to see people collaborating as a group of small towns in doing it. And so let me say there is a role for that regional kind of like holding hands together, but each town has that unique contribution. And the more we develop the mosaic of our regions rather than all the focus is going to be on the Dubbo and we hope all those other little towns are going to survive, which they're not, we've got to change that. We've got to start building the whole mosaic of our regions, which include kind of like the Geraldtons of the world, but the Mount Magnets and the Kews and the Meekatharras and the Mullawas and the Moras, all of those communities have so much to offer. So I'm really excited. The final thing, can I say to the people in Mackay, 20 years ago, again, I was in Mackay and we had the most amazing leadership program there called Community Builders. And what I love that Mackay didn't just do it for themselves as the regional centre, but they created a program that involved all the little towns around them. And I hope that your leadership efforts are being generous to recognise that Mackay is strong, not just because of Mackay, but because of the hinterland that comes out. And I'd really encourage you to look at that leadership program 20 years ago. It was amazing what a whole pile of communities, both within Mackay and the towns around Mackay, did in coming together for what was genuinely a regional community builders kind of like leadership program.
Well, look, Peter, thank you very much. Time is up. I apologise for the background noise. One of the COVID experiences working from home is that you get to hear the neighbours building work. So I apologise for that. As I mentioned, Peter's webinar will be available on the SEGRA website under latest news. And just a promo for next week, with the disruption of COVID-19, much has been made of the shift to using local suppliers. And Buy Local is a familiar campaign to most of us, and many of us have worked hard to encourage the movement. Next week, we'll be welcoming internationally recognised rural businesswoman Mary Reid and Trudy Bartlett from I.D.E.A. Darling Downs Southwest to introduce us to Go Local First, a federal government innovative solution to a regional economic development challenge. So that will be next Wednesday. But if we could all just join together virtually in thanking Peter for a terrific presentation. I'm sure it's left people very inspired. So thank you very much, Peter.
Great.